A man in 1958 wakes at 5:15 a.m. in a small ranch house in Ohio. He eats eggs, drinks coffee, kisses his wife, and drives a 1954 Chevy to the steel mill. He will do this exact thing 11,000 more times before he retires. He never took a sick day. He never called in for mental health. He never told his wife the work was hard. This was not one man. This was most men. The generation that came home from war, went to work, raised families, paid off houses, and died without writing a single memoir about how hard it was. 16 million Americans put on uniforms and crossed oceans. Most were young men, barely out of high school, who learned to live with fear and hunger. And orders barked before dawn. When the war ended, they came home by train and troop ship, carrying duffel bags and memories they rarely spoke aloud. The country they returned to was waiting for them, but it was not the same country they had left. Streets were wider, factories busier, and the promise of a different life hung in the air. Congress had passed the GY Bill in 1944, a law that would change millions of fates. By 1956, nearly 7.8 million veterans had opened the door to a college classroom or a union apprenticeship they never could have afforded before. Some used the benefit to study engineering or teaching. Others learned to weld, to wire houses, to fix engines. Many signed the papers for a first home, a mortgage made possible by a government guarantee that treated their service as a down payment. This was the foundation for a new kind of provider, a man who could set his alarm, pack his lunch, and know that his work would put a roof over his family. He might still wake at night from dreams of shell fire, but in the morning he put on a clean shirt and went to work. One Ohio veteran who fought in the Pacific before earning his union card at the steel mill later said, "I never told my wife what I saw. I just showed up every day." In this generation, showing up was love. Silence was strength. The wound and the strength were the same thing. The sound of mid-century America was the sound of industry, steel hammers, spinning gears, the endless hum of the line. In 1955, about 15 million men and women walked through the gates of factories each morning, most of them men who knew the weight of a lunch pail and the sting of hot metal. Pittsburgh's mills glowed through the night. Gary's rolling plants stretched along the lake, and Detroit's assembly lines ran mile after mile. In the Carolinas, textile looms rattled, feeding the country's appetite for shirts and sheets. A man might have started his shift before sunrise, the floor beneath his boots slick with oil, the air thick with the smell of iron and sweat. He learned to read the rhythm of the machines, to trust the man beside him, to keep his head down and his hands steady. The union card in his wallet meant a steady wage, but it also meant long hours, an average of 42 each week, sometimes more. There were no shortcuts. The work was hard, repetitive, and sometimes dangerous, but it was honest. It was the way a man proved his worth, not by what he said, but by what he built and endured. Pittsburgh, Gary, Detroit, and the mill towns of the South became the backbone of a country that measured its strength in tons of steel and yards of cotton. The men on these lines rarely spoke of pride or pain. Their stories were written in calloused hands and tired backs, in the quiet satisfaction of a shift completed and a family provided for. In that world, showing up was enough. Complaint was weakness. The clang of the factory was the sound of duty, and the silence at day's end was its own kind of love. A new house rose from the clay and gravel at the edge of town, not grand but solid, with a roof that kept out the rain and a porch just wide enough for 2 chairs. By 1950, 57% of American families owned the place where they slept. A quiet revolution built on steady wages and government-backed loans. The median new home measured about 1,200 square feet, with 3 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled of coffee and toast, and a living room where the radio played ball games on Sunday afternoons. The cost, $7,400, was a number a man could reach for if he worked overtime and skipped a vacation or two. This was not the world of architects and blueprints. It was a world of handsaws and borrowed ladders, of evenings spent nailing up drywall or painting window trim by the light of a single bulb. Magazines like Better Homes and Gardens promised that any man could build a deck or repair a furnace if he followed the diagrams closely and asked his neighbor for advice. The pride was in the doing, not the buying. A young father might spend his Saturday digging fence posts or mixing concrete for the driveway, sweat soaking through his undershirt, his mind on nothing but the work in front of him. These houses were more than shelter. They were proof, hammered and painted, that a man's labor could become a home. The walls held in warmth, and the silence after the last nail was driven was its own kind of comfort. A man's truck was more than a way to get to work. It was a test of his hands and his patience, a measure of how much he could fix before calling for help. In the driveway, under the hood of a 1956 Ford pickup, the lessons of self-reliance were passed from father to son. The metal was thick, the bolts rusted tight, the engine simple but stubborn. He kept the owner's manual in the glove box, pages smudged with grease, and a box of tools on the workbench, wrenches, sockets, a battered flashlight that always seemed to flicker at the worst moment. Most repairs happened at home, after supper or on a Saturday morning, with the radio playing baseball in the background. He changed his own oil, replaced the fan belt, rebuilt the carburetor when the engine started to cough. Receipts from the local garage in Anderson, South Carolina, showed only what he couldn't do himself: wheel alignment, new tires, maybe a clutch once in a decade. The rest he handled with his own hands, guided by memory and the quiet confidence that came from years at the factory line. That Ford ran for 200,000 miles, its odometer rolling past numbers it was never meant to reach. The truck was never washed for show, only for function. When something rattled, he listened. When something broke, he fixed it. In the shadow of that open hood, a boy learned that competence was a kind of love. A father, silent at the toolbox, teaching by doing, never by speech. The truck outlasted the new paint on the house and the dog that slept under it. In that world, durability was pride, and every mile was earned. The day began well before the sun. An alarm clock rang at 5:15 in the morning, sharp and insistent, in a dark bedroom at the edge of an Ohio town. A man swung his feet to the floor, pulled on his work clothes, and moved through the house with careful quiet. In kitchens across the country, the same motions played out. Coffee percolating, bread toasted, a fried egg eaten in silence. He packed a lunch, a sandwich, an apple, a thermos, then slipped out the door, careful not to wake the children. By the time the first light touched the windows, he was already halfway to the factory gate. This was the rhythm that shaped family life. 5, sometimes 6 days a week, a man left before dawn and returned at 6 in the evening. The routine was as fixed as the seasons: the car in the driveway, the lunch pail on the counter, the coat hung by the door. At 6 o'clock, supper was served. The whole family sat together, the children washed and waiting, the meal hot and ready. He rarely spoke of his day, and questions were few. His presence at the table was the answer to all of them. Provision was the language he knew. Groceries in the pantry, a mortgage paid on time, shoes for growing feet. These were the ways he held his family. Love was measured in routine, in the reliability of his return each night. Family surveys from the era describe fathers who were always there, but not always close. Oral histories recall the sound of a chair scraping back from the table, the weight of a hand on a child's shoulder. He gave what he could, a steady wage, a fixed routine, a sense that the world was solid and safe. The rest, he kept to himself. Words like anxiety or depression rarely crossed a man's lips in the 1950s. The unwritten rule was simple: keep your troubles to yourself. Men's magazines on the newsstand celebrated the silent hero, the man who fixed what broke and never let on if he was breaking inside. Church sermons praised sacrifice, urging fathers to carry burdens quietly and to put duty first. In the pages of Popular Mechanics, the advice was always practical: how to repair a roof, not how to mend a heart. Few men ever sought help, not from doctors and not from each other. The Veterans Administration kept records of psychiatric beds, but the numbers were small, and the waiting rooms were mostly empty of men like these. The language of feelings was foreign, almost suspect. To complain was to admit weakness, and to ask for comfort was to risk respect. In the mill towns and on the factory lines, a man learned early that pain was something to swallow and forget. This silence was not just habit. It was a code passed from father to son. A man's worth was measured by what he endured without protest, by how much he could carry without asking for relief. The cost of this silence was invisible, but it settled deep. The strength and the wound were the same thing, held tight behind steady eyes and a closed mouth. In the world they built, provision was love, and the price of that love was often paid in words left unspoken. A man could drive from Chicago to Los Angeles without stopping for a single red light. That was something new under the sun. By the end of 1970, more than 41,000 miles of interstate highways cut across the continent, ribbons of concrete and steel, poured and set by hands that never made the headlines. The scale was almost beyond imagining. Bridges spanning rivers, tunnels bored through mountains, exits numbered in the thousands. Each mile was measured out by surveyors, leveled by bulldozers, finished by men in hard hats who worked through summer heat and winter sleet. Their names are lost, but the roads remain. Maps from the Federal Highway Administration show the network growing year by year, a living diagram of ambition and sweat. The crews came from every state: steelworkers from Gary, carpenters from Ohio, laborers from the Carolinas, each bringing the lessons of the factory floor to the open air. They poured foundations, set rebar, ran compressors, and packed lunches in the cabs of their trucks. Nobody called it heroic. It was a job, sometimes just a paycheck, but the result was a country made smaller, possibilities made larger. The highways carried families to new homes, goods to new markets, and children to places their fathers had never seen. The men who built them rarely traveled far themselves. For them, the road was not a promise. It was proof. Proof of what could be done with discipline, with routine, with the silent agreement that a man's work would outlast his words. In the evenings, a man and his wife sat across from each other at a kitchen table, the day's noise settling into the hush of the house. Theirs was a partnership shaped by routine, by the quiet exchange of glances and the steady rhythm of shared duty. Marriage was not a performance or a declaration. It was a promise kept, day after day, long after the first excitement faded. For men born between 1920 and 1945, the wedding vow was meant to last. About 65% of first marriages from this generation reached their 25th anniversary, a span that outlasted most engines and many roofs. This endurance was not always easy or gentle. It was built on habits of self-sacrifice and a belief that stability mattered more than happiness. Arguments faded into silence, and affection was shown in small, practical ways. A fixed sink, a paid bill, a steady presence at the table. Divorce was rare, not because every home was peaceful, but because leaving was almost unthinkable. In this world, to stay was to love, and to endure was to honor the life you had built together. The strength in these marriages was often the same as the wound: love spoken through provision, pain carried quietly, and a bond that held even when words failed. A grandson stands in the garage, turning a wrench in his hand. The toolbox is heavy, its drawers filled with the same tools his grandfather used, each one worn smooth by decades of repairs and quiet lessons. He knows how to fix a leaky faucet, patch a roof, change the oil in a pickup that is older than he is. The instructions were never written down. They were handed over, gesture by gesture, in the hush of Saturday afternoons. But when it comes to words for grief, for fear, for the ache that sometimes settles in the chest, the drawers stay closed. The language of feelings was never passed along. Studies of fathers and sons from this era show a pattern: skill-rich, feeling poor. Boys learn to use their hands, but not always their voices. The legacy is visible in the way a grown man might comfort his own child, not with talk, but with a tightened bolt, a fixed bike, a steady hand on a shoulder. The tools were shared, and the silence too. Competence became the family inheritance, while the vocabulary for sadness or worry was left behind, locked up tight with the rest of what went unsaid. Hospital charts from the 1980s and the 1990s tell a story that the men themselves rarely spoke. The generation that built the factories, highways, and homes carried the residue of their labor into old age. Heart disease claimed them at rates 15% higher than other men their age. Lung cancer cut short lives 30% more often, after decades spent in shops where cigarettes and fumes hung in the air. For those who worked around insulation, brake linings, or shipyard boilers, asbestosis appeared twice as often as in men who had never set foot on a factory floor. These numbers come from CDC mortality tables and union health logs, but behind each line is a man who kept working through the ache in his chest or the cough that wouldn't leave. Few saw a doctor until the pain was too great to ignore. The body paid what the mind refused to count. In the end, the price of silence was written in blood pressure, in x-rays, in the quiet funerals that followed. The strength and the wound were the same thing, measured not in words, but in the toll of hands that never stop building. After they are gone, something lingers in the empty space they once filled. The garage light stays off, the workbench gathers dust, and the drawer of tools sits untouched. A broken porch rail waits for a steady hand that never arrives. In towns across the Midwest and South, neighbors remember the men who could fix anything but rarely spoke of themselves. The phone rings less often for advice. The sound of a hammer at dusk, the steady engine in the driveway, the quiet presence at the church supper has faded. Descendants talk about the absence in practical terms. There's no one to call when the furnace rattles, no one to show how to splice a wire or set a fence post straight. The knowledge that once moved from father to son, neighbor to neighbor, now slips away. Interviews with sons and grandsons circle back to the same memory. A man who taught by doing, who listened more than he talked, who showed love in repairs and routines. The loss is not only of a person, but of a way of being, a model of competence, of provision without complaint, of quiet reliability that once held a community together. What remains is a longing for the steady hands and silent lessons that built more than houses. They built the ground we stand on. There is no easy answer to what these men gained and what they lost. Their hands built the highways, the mills, the neighborhoods, and the routines that still shape the country. Their silence was a shelter, but also a wall. They gave their families a world of order and safety, but kept their own aches locked away. The rules they lived by were simple: show up, provide, never complain. Those rules made them strong, and sometimes made them strangers, even to those they loved. Is it enough to have built so much if the price was to carry pain in private? Was the quiet endurance a form of wisdom or a weight passed down? Did the world they made justify the words they swallowed? Or did the wound grow with each generation, teaching sons to fix everything but themselves? What is the measure of a life? What you build or what you feel? The answer lingers, unresolved, in the silence they left behind. Across America, bridges hold, engines run, and quiet houses stand, testament to men who saw work as love and silence as strength. But the strength and the wound were the same thing. Today, we inherit what they built and the questions they left behind. Did they have it right, or did the silence cost too much? Their example endures, asking us what we're willing to carry and what we dare to speak.